You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
I'm Mariana, and I'm here with Sophie Lewis. Sophie Lewis is a writer and part-time faculty member at the Philadelphia branch of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Her essays have appeared in many journals, both academic and non-academic, including Science, Feminist Review, Viewpoint, Boston Review, The New York Times, and Commune. She's also a member of the ecological writing collective Out of the Woods, an editor of the journal Blindfield, and an occasional translator. Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against the Family is her first book. So we'll start today by reading an excerpt.
What particularly fascinates me about the subject of pregnancy is its morbidity, the little discussed ways that, biophysically speaking, gestating is an unconscionably destructive business. The basic mechanics, according to evolutionary biologist Suzanne Sadadin, have evolved in our species in a manner that can only be described as a ghastly fluke. Scientists have discovered, by experimentally putting placental cells in a mouse carcass, that the active cells of pregnancy, quote, rampage, unquote, unless aggressively contained, through every tissue they touch. Kathy Acker was not citing these studies when she remarked that having cancer was like having a baby, but she was unconsciously channeling its findings. Pregnancy has long been substantially techno-fixed already when it comes to those whose lives really matter. Under capitalism and imperialism, safer, or at least medically supported gestation has typically been the privilege of the upper classes, and the high-end care historically afforded to the rich when they gestate their own young has lately been supplemented by a technology, quote-unquote, that absorbs 100% of the damage from the consumer's point of view. The human labor of a gestational surrogate. Surrogacy, as news media still report, began booming globally in 2011. Then around 2016, the industry began suffering a series of setbacks. Thailand and Nepal banned surrogacy altogether for the foreseeable future, and other major hubs, India, Cambodia, Mexico, legislated against all but altruistic heterosexual surrogacy arrangements. Nevertheless, there are still privately registered, profit-making infertility clinics on every continent listing surrogates for hire who will remain, so they say, genetically entirely unrelated to the babies that customers carry away at the end of the process. For, just as the cannier commentators predicted, surrogacy bans do not halt, but actually fuel the baby trade, rendering gestational workers far more vulnerable than before.
So again, welcome. Maybe just as a starting question, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what made you interested in surrogacy and what does surrogacy bring forth that was absent or less visible in feminist discourse?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I started off doing a PhD that was going to be about critical concepts of nature. This was in a geography department, and geographers, particularly sort of eco-Marxist, critical feminist geographers, spend an awful lot of time talking about the production of nature. And I'd been very influenced by an article by the Marxist geographer Neil Smith on nature as an accumulation strategy. And I thought back in 2013 that this was all very much my cup of tea, and it is to an extent. I was ready then to really get into the weeds of critical sort of eco-Marxist geographical theory about the production of nature, but I wanted to blend it with anti-work politics and theory. My proposal initially didn't really have a particular case study, and in the course of kind of arguing with my two Marxist advisors, both of whom were cis men, as it happens, I found that I kept sort of stumbling on the example of pregnancy. Now, I should say, the way you introduced the topic, I mean, what made you interested in surrogacy, I don't dispute this exactly, but I think it's sort of more accurate in a certain sense to say that I got interested in pregnancy and the Wages for Housework Committee's contention that, quote unquote, every miscarriage is a workplace accident, which positions the labor of gestating a fetus within the sort of gamut of other socially reproductive activities, which for that particular autonomist Italian and then international feminist group, famously Silvia Federici, Maria Rosa della Costa, Leopoldina Fortunati, Selma James, etc., included paid and unpaid cleaning, childcare, and emotional labours to do with looking after and replenishing the capacity of your husband and other kin to go to work the next day. So initially, I was really just talking about the fact that some pregnancy was now waged. And I was sort of being almost a bit pig-headed in that sense because I didn't really want to go into the whole academic conversation about quote-unquote surrogacy. I was being kind of willfully simple-minded, sort of because I couldn't see the difference between pregnancy and surrogacy per se. I mean, the difference is obviously that the product of the labor is destined for quote-unquote somebody else in one scenario and not in the other. But I would sort of refuse the idea that a child should belong to the person who has manufactured it. Of course, a lot of the best parents don't actually have a proprietarian sensibility in their lived relationship with children. They don't actually consider the children that they've biophysically produced to be kind of their belongings in a way. But some people do, and legally there is a whole apparatus that encourages us pretty much to think that way. And there's a very long history, not to mention etymology, of the family as a fiction of biophysical, but also slavery-based sort of ownership. Famulus is a sort of name for a household with a patriarch at its head, where everybody else, wife, servants, children, are basically the part of the ensemble of the chattel belonging to that head of household. But so rejecting that distinction between surrogacy and pregnancy, you're not really left with a lot, apart from the fact that in one scenario, there's the possibility of a wage. So that's a very long answer to your question, but essentially I was finding myself told again and again to go back and read Capital Volume 1, and I was getting kind of annoyed and frustrated. I wanted to go deeper into the question of the more than human, as we would say in geography, more than human with hyphens, and how some forms of labor really challenge orthodox Marxist accounts of the boundaries of the sort of repository of saleable labor power, right? Like there are all these other participants in a human body, because that's what a human body is. According to Donna Haraway, it's already a multi-species relationship. So she doesn't say to be a human is to be in a multi-species relationship. She says to be human is to be a multi-species relationship. And pregnancy is one of these things where you're literally forced to confront the fact that there's more than one entity involved in the performance, the production, the co-production of a certain kind of labor. And so I think it's kind of interesting in that sense to push the boundaries of certain kinds of discourse about work. And yeah, it was a tricky ride because I could see lots of things that weren't being said, but making an incision like that where you want to talk about something that, a huge proportion of the world's population is going to do at some point, i.e. gestate, be it for free or not. But talking about it gets you relegated exclusively to sort of academic conference panels on maternity and childhood and mothering and so on. Whereas as I was sort of mentioning, I wanted to almost put blinkers on and I wasn't very interested in gender, believe it or not. I mean, I end up having things to say about gender partly by virtue of experimentally not saying things about gender, which is a way of saying something about gender as well. But I wanted to really just look at the actual nitty-gritty pregnancy process and ignore its aftermath, and also it's in a sense it's prelude, i.e. the desire for whatever it may be, a family, biogenetic continuity, whatever it is. Really just ignoring all of the reasons why people get into this situation and then what happens to them afterwards, just looking at the work and the workplace of human gestation. So it surprises people sometimes because a book called Full Surrogacy Now does seem as though it might have something to do with what we refer to as surrogacy typically. And then when people realize that it's kind of, it opens at the molecular level almost with this kind of placental interaction and rather grisly, exciting, in some ways a little bit violent traffic between a fetus and a human. And it takes quite a few pages for me to even mention the sort of quote unquote assisted reproductive technology industry, which ends up being my case study, but not in such a way that it is completely separate from what the rest of us do when we do quote unquote unassisted reproduction, which by virtue of treating it that way, I'm trying to show doesn't really exist. What kind of reproduction could be unassisted, right? I'll pause now to let you ask another question.
Can you maybe define what you mean by repronormativity and how you use Black feminist polymaternalisms to contrast to this term?
Yeah, repronormativity. Yeah, that's a word that I bring up as sparingly as possible in the book because it's an academic term and it was developed in an academic context, albeit by some pretty cool legal scholars. It's clunky, so it needs to be applied sort of very carefully. To answer your question straightforwardly,
no problem.
There's I'm basically the repronormative is the disciplines and norms that shape our understanding of what is going on in human reproduction, sort of defining it and sort of delineating the ways in which it then happens and orders human society. So the idea, for instance, that a family is probably mummy, daddy, and children, although there can be sort of then tweaks on that, and you can almost get extensions of the repronormative that involve maybe like homonormative homosexual couples, for example. But the repronormative is kind of the most fundamental component of it for me, I think, is this idea I mentioned of children belonging to the people whose bodies they grew in. And it's linked to very important stuff. This is the link to the Black feminist tradition, to do with where the institution of the private nuclear household, i.e. the family, because that's the shorthand I use. It's a bit hard to constantly say private nuclear household. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, but then that gets me into trouble because people think that I am going after everybody's kind of loved ones, which anyway, we'll get into that later when you ask me about abolishing the family. But there are lots of Black feminist scholars, including Hortense Spillers, notably, and more recently, people like Christina Sharp and Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who argues that Black women, in a sense, when they mother, are structurally speaking always already kind of queer. There's a history I'm looking to where the family is a construct built, in a sense, off the back of an intense racializing gesture. Our modern idea of what a natural family is a fundamentally kind of white supremacist fiction. It was kind of made possible as a unit that helps capitalist accumulation happen smoothly, but by privatizing social reproduction, basically. In a moment where Black and racialized, enslaved people were being sort of constructed as kinless, like without kin, on the American plantation. And that, and people like Gail Rubin kind of build on the analysis of the Black feminists here, leads to a fundamental sort of gender illegibility in the people concerned. So basically enslaved people were ungendered, genderless, because kinless and not the owners of the products of their gestational labor. And thus were not capable of having families, basically. Which is a line of analysis that means that it's a kind of misunderstanding to say, in the face of family abolitionism, what about Black families and queer Black families against the state? Because it's already, the point of the analysis is already to say that queer Black families against the state is family abolitionism. It is the movement of survival pending revolution and social reproduction on the part of those who were never meant to survive, as Audre Lorde says, that is happening kind of in despite of the mechanism of private nuclear familiality that the capitalist state kind of imposes. It's kind of an oxymoron almost to say Black family. I know that's a bit polemical, but that's analysis I'm getting from queer Black feminists such as the ones I've mentioned. And since I'm on this topic already, I want to clarify that that's also what tells us that what's happening at the border of the fascioid American state with its fascioid border regime is not in contradiction of the claim on the part of the United States to be a bastion of family values. When people traveling up from the Mexican border are separated from their children, for example, and thrown into cages and starved to death and deprived of basic human rights, that's not some kind of hypocrisy on the part of a government that claims to be all about the family. That is the point of treating certain sort of relatives, kin, in this way, is to reinscribe the supremacy of the real kin, the real family that is the biopolitical sort of subject, the privileged subject of the familial, the repronormative state, right? So some families thrive because other people are treated as though they have no claim to family, right? There was that, which is why you get news stories such as the one proposing to biogenetically test migrants crossing the border into the United States from Mexico to sort of test if they are really family members vis-a-vis each other, which I think is just a really beautiful summary of the contradictions and myths involved. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could go a little bit into the critical reading that you do of Firestone and Haraway, and if you could talk a little bit about how you see these texts countering current modes of technophilia and accelerationism.
Okay. Yeah, critical readings of Shulamith Firestone and Donna Haraway. Yes, both appear. That's quite a meaty thing. There are ways in which these two critical engagements overlap, and a lot of ways in which they are completely kind of separate in my mind. The obvious kind of thing to say about, on the Firestone note, I'm sort of making a bit of a case for a revival of critical Firestonianism on the basis that with all the flaws, and there are several fairly significant flaws in the dialectic of sex, including a really abysmal treatment of white supremacy and race, linked to some sort of pseudo-Freudian understanding that Firestone has of Black people within a sort of global family, which is super unfortunate and requires negation and relegating to the dustbin, really, of the second wave. But also criticisms people make sometimes of the dialectic of sex that are incorrect. Technological determinism is not something that one can justify charging that text with. I have a lot of love for the utopianism of the dialectic of sex, and it's I'm very moved personally by the story of its author, her descent into despair, depression, madness, and crushing solitude that resulted in her death in conditions that are almost too unbearable of an illustration of the need for what she was calling for, i.e. a kind of transgenerational caring commune based upon, post-capitalist principles of children's liberation and anti-work freedom for those who didn't really want to subject their bodies to the labor of pregnancy unless necessary or unless they wanted to. Nothing could sort of illustrate better the need for what she was talking about, the abolition of the family, than the way that she herself passed not so many years ago. And, there's a lot to be said for her remarks about ectogenesis, although that they're far from the only thing she has to say. And she tends to get reduced to her sort of supposedly wacky prescriptions for machine pregnancy and centralized ectogenesis. But even if you do kind of stick to that component of the dialectic of sex, it turns out, she called it, really. I mean, she says within current conditions, the elaboration of ectogenetic capabilities, being as they are not within kind of gestators' hands, would be a nightmare, right? She uses that word. In Philadelphia, where I live, there are basically kind of elements of her, nightmare coming to fruition with people who are basically concerned to take away power from people who are pregnant in the name of establishing fetal rights, human rights for the preemie, the premature neonate. So the biobag capability tested on lambs successfully last year and this year, and to be trialed on human preemies basically next year, is not something that's being developed in the dialectic sex kind of sense of feminist techno-gestational justice. And communism is being developed by people who want to, quote unquote, solve the abortion problem, which means disconnect the meaning of abortion and killing a fetus. You could perhaps legally mandate that a pregnancy needs to be carried to term, even if part of that is taken over mechanically. It's an area that I think is extremely important to accelerate our analysis on, because it's still kind of unspeakable to defend, as I found out this summer by annoying Tucker Carlson inadvertently, who discovered this view of mine, that abortion is something that, in fact, does need to be defined and defended by feminists as the cessation of the production of the fetus and not just the freedom of the body from the pregnancy, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's a long answer, and it's only half of what you asked. When it comes to Donna Haraway, I have a much more kind of straightforward relationship, really. I think I'm very indebted to the Cyborg Manifesto as a communist, as a feminist, as a queer person. And yes, in more recent years, I mean, the Cyborg Manifesto is a deeply misunderstood text in the same way that Firestone's dialectic is. It's misunderstood as technophiliac by people who I think haven't read it, misunderstood as kind of inviting a saturation of the human body by external widgets, blissed out techno bunny kind of notions of android cyborgicity. But this has nothing to do with what she was actually saying. She was talking about a kind of dynamic relational heuristic for understanding the condition of being a woman, for one thing, from a sort of very ahead of its time, sort of trans, feminist, almost anti-colonial, multi-species, Marxist kind of sensibility, which was deeply rooted in sort of social reproduction feminist accounts of the homework economy and on forms of biological wisdom and knowledge that she was trained in herself, leading her to sort of understand the sort of deeply symbiogenetic, as in, she summarizes this as making with, becoming with, character of our organismic reality. We're full of other entities. We are not really simply ourselves. We're teeming with interactions, with critters, as she also says, that do not even share what we think of as our DNA. And that's what it is to be alive. The boundaries between human and animal, between organism and machine, these are the boundaries that she's fundamentally troubling at the epistemic level. It's deeply sad to kind of reduce all of that to simple, there's nothing technophiliac about it, in fact. Yeah, so in terms of what you're asking about the importance of precisely these much misunderstood as accelerationist texts for countering current modes of technophiliac accelerationism, yes, I think the best parts of the xenofeminist tendency are very much clarifying this. Helen Hester's recent book, Xenofeminism, has a very effective summary of the sorts of the uses of the sort of Harawayvian sensibility and cyborgicity as opposed to the misunderstandings of what these voices had to say of eco-feminists like Maria Mies, for example, who had extremely kind of caricatural understandings of what the dialectic of sex was calling for example. Yeah, so, critical Firestonianism, reading early Haraway against perhaps elements of late Haraway, particularly the parts that, want to drop the fundamental antagonism to capitalism that the Cyborg Manifesto delineated, I would say. But, I'm very much I consider myself in sort of close comradely conversation and in deep, deep debt to Haraway. Yeah.
So you pose this question about what does abolishing the family mean and not mean, and maybe you can speak a bit about that in relation to anti-surrogacy feminism.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that this whole question of surrogacy, which, as I'm saying, is a concept I kind of hope to make unthinkable almost, because children would all be for everyone and pregnancies would, in a sense, all be for everyone. So there'd be no meaning in surrogacy. It brings us back to questions that I think the post-60s anti-utopian moment really kind of wiped from the revolutionary left's collective consciousness. The questions that used to be prevalent among gay communists, gay liberationists, women's liberationists of a certain kind, about how we forge relationships across generations, how we wish to, in a sense, gestate the future within ourselves, and what the limits of romantic, moral conceptualizations of the family and care are. So again, we've lost this because I think very few people seem to remember that a slogan like "keep families together" does not work for queer people. And it's important to do migrant solidarity, of course, but in a sense, it's self-defeating to do it under a rubric that fails so many of the people it's in fact talking about. I mean, many of the people who are most in need of solidarity at the sort of lethal border are potentially queer youth who need to be kind of given solidarity without some sort of potentially equally murderous policy prescription involving reuniting them with people that they may literally not survive living with. So as I say, there's something that people used to understand, I think, implicitly about the slogan, abolish the family. I think people used to understand the problem because feminism used to be far more kind of opposed to the private nuclear household than it is today. Contemporary feminism barely criticizes, I think, those shibboleths that used to be basically the object of queer and gay and feminist antagonism, marriage, this thing, repronormativity, that, as I say, is a bit kind of unsatisfying because it implies that everything was sort of everywhere the same throughout history, which is not the case. It papers over differences such as indigenous practices that should be seen as being salvaged and continued, rather than, not all forms of polymaternalist queer care are projects to abolish anything. Some of them are precisely attempts to kind of keep things alive and salvage practices. So with that caveat aside, the capitalist, patriarchal, cis, heterosexual, etc. family used to be something that I think a broader, at least, I mean, never total, but a broader section of the left used to be on board with doing away with on some level. But interestingly, some of the most vocal critics of any kind of structural challenge to that mode of procreation and reproduction have come from self-defined radical feminists, and that's since the 80s at least. Texts like The Handmaid's Tale actually form part of this post-60s kind of anti-utopian moment, I think. Don't get me started on The Handmaid's Tale and the recent sequel, The Testaments, which I think really confirms the anti-fascist core message at the heart of that universe. And sorry, I said don't get me started, but maybe I should just finish the thought that, in my view, while it's useful that people have been activated as feminist activists since 1985 by Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and in a sense now with the 2019 fan service, The Testaments, it's important that we move instantly, having read these texts, beyond it to something that, in a sense, cleanses our palate, because the notion that is explored in the Testaments is basically the fundamental liberal lie and favorite lie of liberal historiography, that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, except in the case of the Testaments, it's another A.L. She literally plays with those initials, it's in fact part of the vignette, the statue, the monument that finishes the novel. A.L., Aunt Lydia, the woman inside the regime who helped build the fascist slaveocracy, which oppresses you on the basis of having a womb. She's the one who kind of implements some sort of WikiLeaks-style internal operation that brings down Gilead. And I think this is not something that's part of the conversation, the way narratives like this encourage us to see anti-fascist struggle, the emancipation of enslaved people as something that was carried out from above. And I also think the fundamental affective, core of the Gilead, or what am I trying to say here? That silly word, multiverse or something, is a sort of fundamentally kind of post Hillary Clinton's defeat, white lady frustration with being criticized by, for instance, trans, Black, intersectional, anti-colonial feminists. If we were living in Gilead, which, hundreds of op-eds want to say we are. There are so many pieces of journalism out there asserting, if you just Google it, we are literally living in Gilead. If we were living in Gilead, the point is, you would all have to shut up, wouldn't you? We would all be feminists. We could all be feminists together. And that feels so good. And, I don't begrudge people kind of gross, self-indulgent, kind of wound-licking, self-congratulatory moments like that. If you can kind of see them for what they are and then move past them instantly. But unfortunately, it's involved several years worth at this point of cosplaying and wall-to-wall kind of white feminist marketing. And I have to say, I've had enough. Dear me. Where will you go? Right, so anti-surrogacy, that's the point as well of the Handmaid's Tale rant. What people aren't discussing is that the thing that's wrong with Gilead isn't the surrogacy, it's the fascism, right? There's something kind of strange about the falling away of things that feminism more generally was beginning to really discuss in the last few years. I think it's a very much counter-revolutionary moment, I think, the resurgence of Handmaid's Tale fandom, because Gilead is somewhere where sort of trans and queer people don't seem to really exist. And the repronormativity is extremely strong. There's a lot of missed opportunities because, obviously the people who are really separated from the products of their gestational labor, their children, forcibly in a systematic way, existed on the American plantation. They were black enslaved women. But making the figure of this story, the white blonde woman, Elizabeth Moss, is not a sort of helpful, sort of bridge building historic kind of effort of solidarity. It's a sort of appropriative fantasy, unfortunately. It could have been used to buttress the two plinths of the Black feminist reproductive justice movement, namely the right to not only have children and not have children, but also parent the children we have in sort of safe and healthy environments. But unfortunately, it's just been directed towards a really quite strangely lukewarm pro-choice kind of activism. Margaret Atwood's own personal opinion on the question of abortion is, and I quote, "Nobody likes it." And I really think that's not a strong enough kind of position to counter the forces of forced gestation at policy-making levels that we're facing today. So we, more courage. We need more courage than handmade cosplay.
Well, thank you so much. I think we can wrap it up here.
Yeah, thank you very much, e-flux. Thank you, Mariana. Thanks for having me.
Anybody can read more about The Handmaid's Tale and Sophie Lewis's analysis of it. Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against the Family, which is a book out by Verso earlier this year. And we have an excerpt published in the journal in issue 99 that comes from the introduction of the book. Thank you so much.